We humans exhibit rather unique pro-social behavior. We contribute to public goods of many sorts. We even punish non-cooperators at our own costs. And we generally expect other people around us to be nice to us and to help us when we're in need. Now, although most of us take this kind of behavior for granted on a daily basis, it's rather difficult to explain. And especially from an evolutionary point of view, the question is, how could this behavior evolve in the first place? In answering this question, we shall see that the theory of cultural group selection is a promising attempt to solve this problem. But it has an explanatory weakness, the so-called adaptive valley problem. We will then propose another theory called the Backchannel Hypothesis and show how it can solve this adaptive valley problem. And with this, I welcome you to this video presentation of how the Backchannel Hypothesis solves the adaptive valley problem of cultural group selection. Now, I will first give you some background. As just indicated, human prosociality is rather unique. And in particular, this is because this kind of behavior normally happens between unrelated individuals, so between non-kin, and secondly, because it tends to come with a cost to the individual performing it. So this is the evolutionary puzzle that we try to solve. Now, in the field of human evolution, this is called the problem of cooperation. More specifically, altruistic behavior, here defined in the biological sense of behavior that comes with a cost to the individual and benefits another individual, is seemingly at odds with standard approaches of evolutionary biology. This could be, for instance, inclusive fitness, the ability of an individual to get its genes into the next generation, including when those genes are in its relatives. Now, the empirical observation that today's humans exhibit this prosocial and unique prosocial behavior is hardly disputed. But does this mean that evolutionary theory is wrong? Certainly not, and major work in the field of human evolution is devoted to explaining this paradox put forth as the problem of cooperation. Earlier ideas started with the observation that a lot of human behavior is seemingly adapted to the group functioning, and so people argued that it might have evolved for this reason, for the functioning or the benefit of the group. This point of view is called naive group selection. It is widely accepted, though, that this point of view is inconsistent with standard evolutionary theory. Particularly, it's inconsistent with the methodological individualism of biological evolution, which tries to explain the evolution of behavior as it benefits the individual. And now, if we are to explain how cooperation and prosociality evolved, we should be consistent with standard evolutionary theory if we are to have any explanatory power. Acknowledging the insight of naive group selection, that group-level processes might play an important role, the most widely accepted framework for integrating this group level and the individual level is called equilibrium selection. Within the group, individuals follow an evolutionary stable strategy that optimizes inclusive fitness, and this creates an equilibrium within the group. Between the groups, those equilibria are selected that create the highest group fitness. Now, for evolution to take place on the group level, the three conditions of Darwinian evolution need to be satisfied for the group level. And this means we need mechanisms that create differences, that's the variation. We need heritability a reliable transmission of the traits that vary, that cause variation. And thirdly, we need a selective process that can ultimately select the traits that create variation. If we look at groups of chimpanzees in the wild, we see that they differ in their reproductive success. So there's some sort of variation, and there are conflicts going on between them. So there's a type of selective process. However, what we need and what is missing is heritability. And particularly what we need is stable and heritable variation. And for this to hold, the mechanisms that create variation need to far outweigh the intermixing. And how this is obtained then will give us a major insight into the differences between the two theories that we're now going to discuss. Building on the background that I've just given you, I will now introduce the theory of cultural group selection. Particularly, I will use this theory in the version of Boyd and Richardson to researchers that are well known in the field of human evolution and that have collaborated over half a century. So, cultural group selection proposes so-called cultural adaptations, such as norms or traditions, to create rapid variation that outweighs intermixing. So the M is much faster than I. And to ensure heritability, usually punishment is needed. Now, while each individual within a group is best off conforming to the norms and traditions of the group, that is the evolutionarily stable strategy, the competition between different groups with their respective norms and traditions selects for those cultural adaptations, norms and traditions, that give the group the most competitive advantage. And the argument goes then that those most competitive advantage norms or traditions are the most pro-social ones over time, because it is those that allow for the best within group cooperation. Cultural group selection is a promising attempt to solve the problem of cooperation, and it's got a lot going for it. There's a lot of evidence that I won't go into here in favor of cultural group selection. There is theoretical evidence and conceptual evidence and empirical evidence. But cultural group selection has an explanatory weakness, the adaptive valley problem. The adaptive valley problem is acknowledged by the authors Boyd and Richardson themselves, and it presents itself as a vicious cycle. That is, that cultural adaptations require social learning, a behavior that is costly in itself, and a behavior that is only beneficial if there are already cultural adaptations, such as norms, around that can be learned socially. So cultural adaptations require social learning, and social learning requires cultural adaptations. More generally, we argue that cultural group selection requires a couple of traits to get started in the first place. And one of those is over-imitation. Over-imitation is imitation for non-instrumental social reasons. And we need this because culture needs to create variation in a really fast way, also independently from the particular environment. And so those norms or traditions require an imitation for social reasons, because they usually don't have an instrumental reasons to exist in the first place. Secondly, we then also argue that this over-imitation requires a theory of mind, an understanding that other individuals have different mental states from one's own. And we think that cultural group selection requires language. This is particularly the case because cultural group selection requires punishment to enforce norms or traditions. And for this punishment to work, at least for third-person punishment to work, gossip is required in order to coordinate the punishment of individuals, and gossip requires language. Now, those traits are not explained by cultural group selection. They need an explanation there. I will now get to the backchannel hypothesis and how it gets around this adaptive value problem. Now, where cultural group selection proposed a high speed of m, the mechanisms creating variation through cultural adaptations, the backchannel hypothesis argues that there was a decrease in intermixing through an environmental change. In that situation, then, social selection, for instance in the form of female choice, could create variations between groups. And because the backchannel hypothesis, due to the reduced intermixing, doesn't need a high speed of m, the variation creation, it does not need culture, and so it does not need the traits required for cultural group selection. And thus it solves the adaptive value problem because it circumvents it. In those conditions, then, where intermixing is reduced and social selection, for instance, in the form of female choice, can create variation between groups, we argue that a so-called backchannel can naturally form. Now, in its most abstract sense, a backchannel is a medium that translates a benefit to the whole into the benefits of a part. So more specifically, that means ultimately that prosocial behavior is translated through a medium into reproductive success of that individual exhibiting this prosocial behavior. Now, although a backchannel can naturally form, there are conditions for its evolution, and that is that, for instance, the female choice criterion, the M, the mechanism that creates variation, that this is selected for on the group level for its ability to create group benefits. And if we spin this further abstractly, this is a system that has an attractor. And that attractor is that females choose males according to the contribution to the proliferation of the group. So far, we have developed the backchannel hypothesis in a rather abstract way. We started from the conditions of equilibrium selection that we want to conform to, and we tried to lay out how an evolutionary configuration could arise where the mechanisms that create variation between groups could be selected for on a group level, slowly steering the system towards the attractor of higher prosociality. Now, because this was a rather abstract and first principles approach so far, what we want to do now is provide at least one plausible evolutionary narrative provided by the backchannel hypothesis. And we start out with the drying of East Africa. This is a process that started around 10 million years ago, and it was a progressive drying and cooling of East Africa, leading to a change in the environment. Particularly, this was a change from dense forest to more of an open savanna. And we say in this environment, groups got reproductively isolated because both female migration and male intrusion was severely limited due to the openness of the environment. And we then also say in that situation, social selection, such as female choice, could start to randomly create variations between groups. And thus the conditions for equilibrium selection are met. We have created stable and heritable variation. Now, in this situation, we think this backchannel could form, a backchannel that translates group beneficial behavior into the reproductive success of an agent. And one way of thinking about this is, for instance, that females could choose good hunters. Now, the medium of translation here could be a meat displayed. So a good hunter or a better hunter would bring home more food, and then females would choose the hunters that provide the most food. So the meat display here is the medium of translation of the back channel. And what can then happen is a so-called Fisherian process, Fisherian sexual selection, where females progressively choose more and more extreme versions of the trait. Right? This could lead that female choice is forever more food provision, meat provision, right? To an extent that there might be surplus food available. Right? And what could then happen that female choice varies again, and what is selected for is the female choice that allows food theft and then perhaps food sharing. So this is a female choice that over time varies and could be selected for on the group level. And this is a continuous process that we argue could go on to ultimately create more and more prosocial behavior, mostly then mediated by language and a reputation economy. Right? But coming back to the meat sharing, this is also an empirical observation that we see in current hunter-gatherer societies. The fact that hunters bring back the meat from the hunt, but that meat is equally shared amongst all members of the group, independent of their contribution. Right? So there still must be some relationship between the prosocial act of hunting for others and reproductive success. And this is the reputation of the hunter. So although the meat is shared equally amongst all members of the group, everyone is told who hunted the meat, and thus the hunter who provided the meat gains reputation. And this reputation then is empirically correlated with reproductive success. We thus conclude that the Backchannel hypothesis can solve the adaptive value problem of cultural group selection. And additionally, we say that the Backchannel hypothesis has the possibility to explain most uniquely human traits and how they evolved within one explanatory framework. And with this, I thank you for your attention, and you can scan the code here for further information. And if you want to collaborate with us on further research, please check the contact info in the video description.